Hello everybody and welcome to this video where I'm going to analyse Sonnet 29 by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. This poem is a really complex poem in as much as just understanding what is going on takes quite a lot of effort. So we'll cover that in this video, but we'll also look at a really detailed analysis of the way that the poet uses language, structure and form to convey meaning. We'll look at alternative interpretations, different ways of viewing the poem, because that always helps you to get the highest grades in your exams, rather than to say, this quotation means this. To explore different possible ways of interpreting the poem is what we're looking at. We'll look at the context and the way that a Victorian audience would interpret the poem and the way we might look at it today. Everything that I'm going to go through in this video is incredibly detailed, and so that you don't have to furiously scribble notes down, I've actually published an ebook which contains all of the notes that I'm about to go through. And it also contains notes on all of the other poems that I've made videos on for this 2017 exam. So what you need to do if you want to get a copy of the ebook is go to mrbruff.com. It's called Mr. Bruff's Guide to My Last Duchess. It contains other poems too, including this one. And I've just written up thousands of words of notes of everything that I'm about to go through. So pick up a copy of that and sit back and enjoy the video. So let's begin with the poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning. She was a really fascinating woman. A Victorian poet, she was born in 1806 and died in 1861. She suffered from illness for a lot of her life. She was an invalid, bedridden, had an addiction to laudanum, a powerful painkiller, which many people think inspired some of the more creative elements of her poetry. She was a child prodigy. She was actually published at the age of 15, a very famous poet, famous both in the UK and in America. This is at a time obviously way before the internet and television and all the rest of it, so to be famous around the world was amazing. And she really was a celebrity poet. She married the poet Robert Browning, and Robert Browning actually wrote to her as a fan, and she ended up marrying him. Now, Elizabeth had a very controlling father who refused to let any of his daughters get married, and so there was this sort of secret courtship between Robert and Elizabeth. They wrote 500 letters to each other, and they're actually published. When she died, her son put them up for publication. You can get that free on Amazon on the Kindle. Really interesting. I was reading through them over the last few days, doing a bit of research for this video, and it's really interesting to see how they started by writing formally to each other, but they sort of fell in love through their letters. Obviously, this poem is a poem about Robert Browning, written before they were married, and you can see this sense of a secretive relationship because of the controlling father. Indeed, when they did get married, the father disowned Elizabeth, never spoke to her again. They moved to Italy. A very religious woman, a Christian woman who believes, and this is her quote, "Christ's religion is essentially poetry, poetry glorified." And we're going to look at the religious imagery as well as the physical and sexual imagery in this poem. So that's the poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning. A little bit about the context of the publication of these poems, because it's quite a sort of a head trip to get around. Basically, when they were courting, when they were going out, before they were married, certainly before they would have had sex, Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote a collection of 44 sonnets about her love for Robert. The complex thing is, though, she didn't write them for him. They address him, but she certainly never gave them to him. And it wasn't until a few years after they were married, and this is a quotation from the husband, Robert Browning, that he was talking about he didn't like the idea of writing poetry about love. And then we see that he says, "And next morning she said hesitatingly, 'Do you know I once wrote some poems about you? There they are, if you care to see them.'" So it was years later, a few years after getting married, before Robert actually, even heard about these poems. So that explains a very personal nature to this poetry. It really wasn't written for publication. But when Robert saw the poems, it grew into a collection called Sonnets from the Portuguese. Robert said to her, these were the best sonnets he'd seen since Shakespeare, and they had to be published. And they got them published, but obviously they were very personal. So to keep sort of anonymity, they actually published this selection in a book called Sonnets from the Portuguese. And they actually said, look, we found these famous Portuguese sonnets, or these Portuguese love poems, and we've translated them into English, and we hope you enjoy them. A little bit later it came out that they were, in fact, the poems from Elizabeth to her husband, or future husband. Why sonnets from the Portuguese? Well, two things. Number one, it was a nickname. Robert used to call his wife My Little Portuguese. But also Elizabeth really liked Louis de Camões, the 16th century Portuguese sonneteer, and occasionally would even favour his rhyme scheme, ABAB, CC, but not in this poem. But so maybe it was a kind of link to that. So that's just the interesting sort of story around when it was published. But now let's move to the poem itself and the literal meaning. So if we look at these first 4 lines, I think of thee, my thoughts do twine and bud about thee, as wild vines about a tree. Put out broad leaves, and soon there's naught to see, except the straggling green which hides the wood. And basically what she's saying here, we can say she, we can say this is Elizabeth. We can say this is Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Often in a poem you cannot assume that the poet is using their own voice, but we know this is because we know they were written about her future husband. So she's saying, I think of you, and my thoughts grow around you like vines which grow quickly around a tree. And then my thoughts about you are growing to such a huge size, there's nothing left of you to see beneath them, except a tiny piece of you. So my thoughts about you are essentially consuming you and covering over you. And then it moves on here. Yet, O my palm tree, be it understood, I will not have my thoughts instead of thee. So what she's saying is, but my love, make sure you understand the point here. I'm not saying that my thoughts of you are preferable to actually having you. And then it says, who art dearer, better, rather instantly, renew thy presence as a strong tree should, rustle thy boughs and set thy trunk all bare, and let these bands of greenery which ensphere thee. And so just going to say what she's saying there is the actual you is better than thoughts about you. So come back to me like a strong tree, shake yourself free from my thoughts, and let my thoughts of you. And then it carries on in the poem, drop heavily down, burst, shattered everywhere. Because in this deep joy to see and hear thee, and breathe within thy shadow a new air, I do not think of thee, I am too near thee. So what she's saying is, let my thoughts smash to pieces, because it gives me such deep joy to be in your presence. Under your care, the world is a better place, and I want to be with you so much that I won't have to think of you anymore, because I actually will be with you. So it's a very complex poem, and just understanding this idea and the imagery throughout is pretty tricky. Now, a few things to cover about the theme, and I think there's one overarching theme, and then it's explored in a couple of different ways. So this sonnet was written by Barrett Browning to Robert Browning, the man she was engaged to marry. And in this sonnet, the poet expresses the idea that thinking of her future husband is such an intense feeling that it ultimately overpowers her. So we could therefore say the theme of the poem is the overwhelming intensity of love. So you want to write that down. The overwhelming intensity of love. So once we've understood what we think the theme of the poem is, we're then going to look at, well, how is that theme presented through language, through structure, and through form? Now, a little bit of a sort of tip. Sorry. Most people analyse language. They say, well, this word, this phrase. But if we can analyse structure and form, that automatically puts us way ahead of everybody else because people find it too tricky. So I'm going to start by talking about the form. And the form is, of course, the sonnet form. Okay, so let me talk to you a bit about the sonnet form. Now, the sonnet form was an Italian form of poetry invented by Giacomo da Lentini in the 13th century and established as a love poem from a man to a woman, 14 lines long. The first 8 lines, which we call the octave, pose a problem. So in this poem, the problem is really my thoughts are overwhelming me. In the last 6 lines, the sestet solves the problem. And the solving of the problem suggested in this poem is my thoughts are overwhelming me, so let's shake off my thoughts and actually you come and physically see me. And line 9, the volta, is a sharp turn which brings about the move to the resolution. And there's an ABBA rhyme scheme. And that's what we call the Petrarchan sonnet. Now, it wasn't invented by Petrarch, it was invented by Giacomo da Lentini, but made famous by this Lady Gaga lookalike Petrarch, a 14th century Italian poet. He was a priest, and he fell in love with, sort of love at first sight, a lady called Laura. And what do you do when you're in love with somebody? You write them 366 sonnets of unrequited love. Now, she was a married woman. She didn't want to have anything to do with him. It was never a love which was physically realized. They never slept together or anything. He just was in love with her, wrote these poems. Now, this is interesting, though. Later, we have the English sonnet, which was established by Sir Philip Sidney in the 16th century, still 14 lines, but now in quatrains, so 3 verses of 4, and a couplet at the end, a rhyming couplet, and in that rhyming couplet at the end comes the volta. It's in iambic pentameter, 10 syllables per line, alternating stress, and the rhyme scheme is different, A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. And that's what we have come to know as the Shakespearean sonnet. Now, why do I say about those two types of sonnet? Well, what's interesting looking at Sonnet 29, as I've established the rhyme scheme down the side here, is that this is a Petrarchan sonnet. So it's interesting to think about Elizabeth Barrett Browning writing in Victorian England when the Shakespearean sonnet was certainly the dominant form of sonnet writing. Why did she not use the Shakespearean sonnet form but revert back to the Petrarchan sonnet form? And there are definitely a couple of things that jump out. A lot of Shakespeare's sonnets were overtly sexual. They were to mistresses, they were to friends, they were love and friendship love. And it might be that Barrett Browning felt that she could relate more to Petrarch's sort of intense feeling before anything had been physically consummated, before anything had, before marriage, basically. A love that is all-consuming but not physically recognized, rather than Shakespeare's sonnets, which are largely about sort of sexual love. So it might be that she felt that Petrarch's form of sonnets were more appropriate for the love that she felt. But another interpretation is that there are numerous examples in the poem of the poet using archaic, old language and forms, and perhaps she uses this old form of love poetry to symbolize how her love is timeless. But it's clear then that the sonnet follows the Petrarchan sonnet form, and you can see on the screen, it's got the octave, the sestet, it's got the correct rhyme scheme, etc. But there are some notable differences, and this is really clever because Barrett Browning wrote these 44 sonnets, and they're all sort of perfect Petrarchan sonnets, but this one actually has a couple of little things that are slightly not perfect, and I think that really matches in with the theme of the overwhelming power of love. So if we have a look at line 3, put out broad leaves and soon there's naught to see. Now in this line, the words out, broad and leaves are all stressed. We put our stress, our intonation when we're reading them. So this is now not iambic pentameter, which would go stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed. So we think, well, why is this? Why does the poet deliberately slip out of the iambic pentameter in line 3? And perhaps Barrett Browning is suggesting how powerful and intense her thoughts are at this moment. And here we can see that the poet is deliberately playing with the form to express her feelings about the intensity of love. Her love, essentially, is so overwhelming that it's causing her to lose control, not just of herself, but of her poetic form. Very, very clever. And then if we look at the structure, let's consider the turn, the volta, which is the change between the octave and the sestet in line 8. But in this sonnet, we find the turn actually straddled between lines 7 and 8. Rather instantly renew thy presence. That's the twist, that's the turn, that's the volta. My thoughts are overwhelming me, and the twist is, so come back to me, come and see me. So I don't have to be thinking about you anymore because you're actually here. But it's very, very, very rare to have it straddle 2 lines as it does here. And again, it's the same as before, isn't it? Why does Barrett Browning deliberately break some of the rules of a sonnet? Well, if the sonnet is a poem of perfect love, perhaps Barrett Browning refuses to follow the form perfectly to reflect how the love she has for Robert is not perfect, and it's not going to be so until the two are together. In other words, I can't write the perfect love poem because my love is not perfect. I don't have the one I love with me. Or it could be the same as the previous point, that she's sort of saying, I'm so overwhelmed that I'm unable to use the form correctly. The intensity of my feelings for you are overpowering my use of form and structure. Now, I think there are a couple of ways to look at this poem, but before we get to that, I want to have a look at the conceit of the poem. It's important to say, this poem could mean this and it could also mean this. So I've picked out 4 different things that you can analyse about this poem. You can look at the way it represents physical love or sexual love. And obviously, this is all within the realm and all within the kind of boundaries of Elizabeth is not having sex with this person, but is looking forward to doing so. And we can also look at it as being about spiritual love. As we talked about, Barrett Browning was a deeply religious woman, and there's lots of evidence of sort of biblical reference in the poem. Then it's also interesting to think about, well, how do we interpret this poem if we're looking at it in terms of the Victorian context, what it tells us about women in Victorian England and that sort of thing, and how do we look at it when we look at it today in a modern context, and how attitudes to women have changed, and how does this poem reflect that? So those are the 4 ways I want to look at this poem. But I want to talk to you about a conceit. Now you want to write this word down, it's an important word. So if you don't know what a conceit is a metaphor which appears not just once or twice, but it actually appears throughout the entirety of a poem. Now in this poem, the conceit is that of the poet's thoughts being bands of greenery, like vines, and of her beloved Robert being a tree. So, how do we put all that together? Well, on a simple level, the imagery of nature is quite good for a love poem because, like a plant, the poet's love is natural, it's growing, it's alive, it's flourishing, all of that kind of thing. But the conceit was also well chosen because it fits both the sexual and spiritual love aspects of the poem. Now, personally, I don't think the idea of sexual love and spiritual love is a contradiction. I think if we're saying that the poem is about the way the love is all-consuming and overwhelming, all-consuming, intense love, then it's actually quite appropriate that it sort of inhabits both the physical and the spiritual side of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. In other words, it's all-consuming. It takes over my physical side and it takes over my spiritual side. And I think the poet has used a lot of imagery in this poem which can be interpreted as both sexual and spiritual. Which is very clever. So it's possible to interpret this conceit as an expression of powerful sexual love and passion. On a very simple level, just thinking about what these vines do, and you can see the vine here, you've got the tree and the vines are wrapping themselves around it. So on a very simple level, what a vine does is it wraps around and intertwines itself and grows quickly out of control and kind of explores every nook and cranny and clings to the thing that it is growing on. And like a vine, then, the poet wants to cover her lover. She wants to wrap around him, intertwine herself with him. And, her love, like a vine, is growing quickly, easily gets out of control. We see that in the poem, and that, reflects the poet's intense and sort of uncontrollable passion. So the image, the extended metaphor, the conceit of the vine, it works. But the language choice also backs that up. If we think about this quotation, my thoughts do twine and bud about thee, as wild vines about a tree. Now, on a simple level, the literal level, we always look in a poem for what is literally going on here, and then we look at, okay, can we interpret that on a deeper level? So on a literal level, she's saying, look, I'm thinking about you so much, my thoughts are growing around you, just like vines do around a tree. But look at the use of the language. Look at twine, bud, wild, and already just the imagery of the vine that I've just explored. The word twine is clever. This is used as a verb here, and it means to twist together, to interwind, to interweave, to form by twisting together, and to interlace. So it's a very strong image of the sex act of two people, their bodies sort of intertwining with each other, interlocking with each other. Also the word bud now, but there's a great article called Flower Symbolism as Female Sexual Metaphor. Throughout literature, a bud, a flower, has often been used as a symbol of the female genitalia. So there's highly sexual imagery whenever you see the word bud, something Shakespeare often used. And then the word wild just suggests that this is an uncontrollable passion. So I think that's a great example of a quotation which has all of this sensual, physical, sexual imagery. There is, of course, another section. I'm sure if you're looking at this poem in class, you can think there are bits which seem to sound a bit rude, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's absolutely valid. So this bit, rustle thy boughs and set thy trunk all bare, and let these bands of greenery which ensphere thee drop heavily down, burst, shattered everywhere. So again, on the literal level, what is she saying? Well, she's just saying, shake all of my thoughts off you, and come to me. But of course, on the deeper level, this sounds very sexual. Set thy trunk all bare, drop heavily down. It sounds like, get naked, take your clothes off. And then underneath that, this bit, burst, shattered everywhere. This is incredibly sensual imagery, and it's evocative of sexual climax, to burst, shattered everywhere. So it's a very, sexual side to the poem. But as I said, that is in the context of, this is what I want to do to you. This is not in the context of maybe like some of Shakespeare's sonnets, this is what I do to you, my mistress. This is, the love of my life, who I'm going to marry. This is what I want. So there's a sort of purity and decency to the poem as well. And of course, given the sense that these were never going to be published, let alone even given to Robert, it's, just a very personal expression, seems to be Elizabeth Barrett Browning just letting out her emotions onto paper. So let's have a look at the spiritual interpretation then. We can stick with the same quotations. My thoughts do twine and bud about thee as wild vines about a tree. When Elizabeth sat down to write this poem, why did she choose the idea of trees and branches and vines? Where does that come from? Well, one reference is that it's very much like the Bible. Jesus says in John 15:5, I am the vine, ye are the branches. He that abideth in me and I in him, the same bringeth forth much fruit. There is a wealth of biblical imagery and symbolism related to the idea that Jesus is, the sort of the tree or the vine, and that Christians are in need of connecting with him, and he will, provide everything they need. And of course, that's very similar to the idea of the love in this poem as well. The idea of, I cannot survive if I'm not connected to you. You're the giver of life. You hold me together. So in some ways, Elizabeth is writing about Robert Browning as if, he is godlike, and just like, the imagery of God as the the vine. But it goes further than that. There's a Song of Songs is a book in the Bible, quite a unique book in the Bible, that is all about celebrating sexual love. Now, it's a sort of contextual thing, really, the idea that, well, surely Christianity is against sex, but actually that's not true at all. If you believe in the Bible, what the Bible says is that God created sex, and that sex is to be enjoyed and delighted in the context of marriage, and that the issue is, sex outside of marriage. So if you look at it in that context, well, of course, Elizabeth and Robert, they're getting married. They're not even having time alone together, probably, in this courtship. They're just writing to each other. So they're not contradicting that at all. And the feelings that she has for him are absolutely fine, and they're going to be consummated in marriage. So this is the Song of Solomon, chapter 7. And look at this quotation. This isn't the poem, this is from the Bible. And look at this. I said, I will go to the palm tree, take hold of the boughs, clusters of the vine, let us see if the vine flourish, the pomegranates bud forth. I don't think it's a mistake that this many words that I've underlined here, palm tree, boughs, vine, bud, they're all in the poem, and they're all in Song of Songs 7. So you can draw your own conclusions from that. Perhaps she's sort of saying, just highlighting the sort of sanctity and sort of spiritual correctness in the feelings that she feels for her future husband. But it seems to me that there is a strong link between the poem and the Bible imagery. And that's not all. There are also some religious uses of language in the poem. You might look at the poem at this word "thee" and think, that's a very old word. Why is that used? And of course, it means you. But actually, it was a very old word at the time that it was used by the poet. This word really went out of fashion in the 17th century, but is used by the poet almost 200 years later. And there are a couple of possible explanations for why that is. You could say that just like the use of the ancient Petrarchan sonnet form, this language use can be seen to reinforce the notion that Barrett Browning's love is timeless. But also it's interesting to think of, where is the word "thee" used? Because although it fell out of general usage in the 1600s, it was still widely used in religious circles and churches. And I think the poet's use of the word could be argued that it reinforces the notion that the love she has for her future husband is sacred. And finally, the word "you" is actually used in formal circumstances, whereas "thee" expresses intimacy. So it's more appropriate as an intimate word. So these three interpretations of one single word demonstrate the depths of analysis which are possible with poetry. And I always think that's interesting. People struggle with, how much could I write? But you could write a whole exam answer about this word. I wouldn't recommend it, though. So that's the language use and the way the poem can be seen as sexual and the way that the poem can be seen as spiritual. What I want to finish on is, how does this poem present women? How would this poem have been received in Victorian England? How do we receive it today? Now, Elizabeth Barrett Browning was a poet who wrote huge amounts, and a lot of what she wrote actually explicitly and directly confronted political issues, women's rights, slavery, this kind of thing, but it's her love poetry which we study today. And that's very interesting, I think, because as a modern reader, we might just think, oh yeah, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, her most famous poem is Sonnet 43. How do I love thee, let me count the ways. So why is it that this very successful, comprehensive writer, we sort of pin down to the love poems that she wrote to her husband? Well, it's interesting to think about how women were presented in poetry in Victorian England, and then to think about how women are presented by Elizabeth Barrett Browning in her poetry. Many Victorian poets, Robert Browning, Alfred Lord Tennyson, wrote about women and presented them as weak, enfeebled. And not always, but largely. Now, you would think that Elizabeth Barrett Browning as a woman herself would be different, that she would write about female empowerment. And you can argue both sides. To begin with, we go back to the imagery, the conceit of the vine. And what does this tell us about women? Well, in some ways, you can think actually this presents women as weak because the woman is the vine and she needs a man to tie herself to. So if you think about that, the vine is weak. It needs something to hold it up and offer stability. It has to grow against something. A vine can't just grow up into the sky. Even a grapevine needs to be held up on sticks and something to support it. And he, the man, is the strong tree. So he's the solid oak or palm tree, and she's dependent on him. So it doesn't present women in a very strong light in that sense. And you have to think about the role of Victorian women in society. Women had so few rights. They couldn't vote, they couldn't sue, they were dependent completely on men. There was, just awful inequality between men and women, which could be argued is backed up through the imagery of the woman as the vine and the man as the tree. Now, on the side of that, this then is a presentation of what we might think of as respectable women in Victorian England. Because Victorian England did not want to promote women who were writing about women's rights, who were taking on political issues. They liked the idea of a woman who was identified by marriage and her dependence on a man. Her identity depended on the presence of a man. So for the Victorian reader, these sonnets, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, were the epitome of appropriate poetry for women to write, because they showed a woman in her best role, loving and expressing sentiments of love and being dependent on a man. And it's quite tragic, really, that we only see today the poetry of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and we only see the sonnets that she wrote to Robert Browning. Now, Robert Browning wasn't a very successful writer when he was, alive and married and courting Elizabeth Barrett Browning. She was far and away more successful. Robert's poems were a flop. His plays weren't produced. It's only much later on that we've grown to like the poetry of Robert Browning. And on this channel and in the ebook, there's also a detailed analysis of My Last Duchess. Whereas Elizabeth Barrett Browning was very successful. But yet today we kind of pin her down to the love poetry she wrote to the famous Robert Browning, which really sort of devalues her as a writer. So that's one view, that the vine is weak and it needs the man and the tree, and he's the strong one, and you've got to cling to him because you're going to fall down without him. There is an alternative interpretation which we might offer today, to think of this more as a feminist poem. You see, the image of the wooden trunk surrounded by lush leaves reimagines the sex act. You see, normally, of course, it is the man who penetrates the woman. But here we see a reversal of that. And actually, the woman is engulfing the man. It's deliberately disrupting the conventional gender roles of the man taking the woman. Here we have the woman consuming and taking the man. The gender roles are reversed. The ravishing male becomes the devouring female. So you can see it as a sort of female empowerment, and she goes and gets him. It just depends which way you look at it. Guys, I hope you found this video useful. Obviously, it took me hours, probably about 10 hours of preparation. Please do pick up my ebooks at mrbruff.com and give this video a thumbs up. Share it. I love getting more and more subscribers. I'm recording this video on a day when I've hit 30,000 subscribers. But it would be great if you would share these videos and kind of tell your friends about them, because I put in so much work, and I really appreciate you guys watching the videos and sharing them, thumbs up, subscribe, that kind of thing.